Hey guys, Shane here, so welcome to this painting tutorial, and in this video we're going to take a look at painting German oak leaf camouflage patterns. So the figure we're going to be using in this tutorial is from Rado Miniatures, so I've picked up a few of their sets and I would strongly recommend them. They're absolutely fantastic resin figures. So flashing up now are all the colours I used in this tutorial, so do feel free to pause and take note. So we're going to start off by painting the base colour for his camouflage smock, and for this we're going to take a mixture of flat brown and German pale brown. So I'm going to make up a very rough mixture of about maybe 60-65% pale brown to the remainder of our flat brown. And I'm going to try to create a very rich sandy brown colour. I'm also going to thin it down with just a little bit of water just to make it flow a little bit easier. And I'm going to start slowly building this up onto our figure. Now I've pre-primed our figure in flat black, just to give us a good shade layer to build up on. And I've also painted in his face and his hands, and I have a link in the video description on how I do that. So you can see that my paint is very transparent. I perhaps maybe over thinned this paint ever so slightly, however it's not really a big problem. I just put a small amount of paint on my brush at a time, and I just take care not to flood the model with paint and just make sure everything's nice and even. So now we're going to create our first highlight, and for that we're going to go back to our German pale brown, and I'm going to make up a new mixture, and this time I'm only going to add a small tab of flat brown, just the smallest amount of flat brown, and about 70-75% to pale brown. And this is going to be our first highlight colour. It's not too intense, this is just a nice mid-tone, and I'm going to start working this into the top two creases, any area where the material is pulled close to the body where it's taut, so there's no area for folds to form, and that's going to catch the most light. Now I've thinned this paint down again a little bit just to make it go down nice and smooth, and it also makes it a little bit transparent, which is good. It just makes it a little bit easier to make nice simple transitions that aren't too aggressive. So I'll pick, in this case, a really prominent crease here, and then I'll just start sketching out that detail. It's also very important that we use a brush that can keep a good point. Now normally I'd use my Winsor & Newton Cotton range, which is my go-to brushes for figure painting. However, with the lockdown here in Ireland I can't actually get them, just they're all out of stock. So I managed to pick up a very cheap set of brushes for about €15, and these are actually not bad. They've been holding up quite well. I can't remember the name of the make at the moment, however I will leave a link to them in the video description, especially if any beginners are looking for some more affordable brushes, and so far these are doing a great job. As you can see, I'm really putting this highlight down on everything other than the deepest recesses. But keeping our paint nice and thin, it's just a very gradual transition from dark to, or from shade to highlight, should I say. And it's just nice and natural, so I'm not really rushing this, I'm just doing a little section at a time. So I'm going to push the highlight value even further by adding more pale brown into our mix. This is a nice thing with a wet palette. It allows us just to keep adding lighter shades to our mixes as we go without the paint drying out. And it's going to thin it out again with a little bit of water. Now I'm going to be very careful with this colour. I don't want to completely undo the darker tone underneath, and I'm going to really focus this again on the tops of creases and any real pronounced details I want to pop. So again, I'm only having a little bit of paint on my brush, making sure it keeps a nice good point, and also I'm making sure that I clean my brush every few minutes just to make sure that paint doesn't start drying on the brush. So again, I'm just tracing out the tops of these creases. I'm also focusing on the camouflage loops on the smock and on the helmet cover. And I'm really just trying to catch the most prominent details. And I want to make these details pop and just draw a little bit of visual interest in them. So now with the smock highlighted, we're going to start adding the actual camouflage pattern itself. And we're going to start off with the dark green blotches, and for this we're going to use dark black green. So this actually is not a very difficult camouflage pattern to recreate. It's actually very straightforward once you kind of get used to it. So we're going to start off by just thinning down some of our dark black green. And I'm going to start creating some oblong land masses. That's the best way to describe it. And what I'll do is when I get to the edges of these oblong shapes, I will create kind of rounded protrusions or extrusions coming out of the edges of these land masses. So everything should be kind of organic, it should be rounded, and it should have kind of fingers extending out from some of the edges of these blotches that we're creating. And the idea that you should try to get your head around is that we're trying to create a silhouette of foliage, of branches, of leaves and of trees. Again, it's very important too that we thin down the paint just so it flows nice and easy, so we don't totally overwhelm any of these details or obliterate them under a flood of paint. So I'm just going to be kind of careful, keeping a little bit of paint on my brush at a time and just slowly block it out at first, and then I'll kind of come back and refine and fill in these shapes with subsequent layers. Another thing too is to have a photograph of the actual pattern at hand. So I have a photo on my phone just out of shot here, and I'm just referring to that photograph as a reference just so I can kind of match what I'm seeing and try to mimic these patterns. So I'm doing this much larger landmass here on his back, and you can see that I'm really just using the tip of my brush and I'm kind of dabbing as I paint. You'll kind of see that I'll kind of push the tip of the brush in, and that's what's creating these oblong kind of fingers that are coming out of the edges. It just creates a lovely rounded irregular pattern. So I'll kind of tap in with the brush and then fill out the rest of the form. So once I'm happy with that, I'm going to start creating the light camouflage base. And for this we're going to use a mixture of olive green, English uniform, military green and sunny skin tone. So we're going to make our mixture of about 10% or so sunny skin tone, small tab of military green, about 10-15% or so of English uniform, and then the remainder of our olive green. And this is going to make a slightly muted olive green colour. Now Vallejo has a colour for this, but it's like a neon green, it's far too bright. So we need to knock it back. And again, I've switched down to a nice fine tip brush here, and we're going to start filling in the darker land masses with this lighter green. I'm going to start tapping with my brush to create these lovely oblong shapes. I don't have to fill the entire dark mass with this lighter colour. I do want to keep a boundary or an outline of dark green. So I'm just going to take my time and kind of fill out these shapes. In some of the larger blotches, what I actually will do is I'll only do a small dab, like a single dot of light green like I'm doing here, and then I might do a blotch of light green beside it. So you might have several independent shapes within the darker green. That is very accurate to the actual original camouflage pattern. So it's not just a solid green mass, so ensure that you keep the dark green outline visible, as well as have some sections where it's only a few small blobs of light green within the dark, if you like. So I'm just working in sections, so I'll just slowly build up the pattern and then I'll come back in and fill it in and just make it a nice solid colour. So in this larger dark mass, I can actually do a lot more individual light green dots as well as larger blotches. And it just adds a lot of visual interest as well as being true to the original camouflage pattern. So now I'm going to go back to our dark black green, and then we're going to start just tidying up some of these borders and some of these outlines. And I'm also going to start adding just individual black green dots in the dark brown areas as well as maybe adding a few more back into the light green areas just to break things up ever so slightly. So now we're going to go back to our light green. So some of the larger dark green dots have a little bit of a shadow of light green interlocking into them. So I'm just going to paint a little bit of light green around the edges of some of these dark green dots here. I'll also just do a few small individual dots of the light green while I'm at it. So that's our main camouflage now, completely blocked in. So now we're going to start adding some shadow, and for this we're going to use some glazes. So I'm going to take some Vallejo Game Ink Sepia and some of their glaze medium. And I'm roughly going to mix this up 50-50. If you want the glaze to be a little lighter, just keep adding more glaze medium. And we're going to use this to add some shadow and also try to frame some of the more pronounced details on the sculpt. So I'm going to apply this very carefully into creases and any type of areas I want to highlight or frame. So into the most pronounced recesses I'm going to put this into. I'm also going to use it to frame certain details like the foliage loops on his smock, and any other type of seam line or machine line on the actual uniform. I'm also going to trace those details with a little bit of this wash. So I'm also going to start adding some more detail to the uniform. So I'm just going to start painting his tunic, and for this I'm just going to take some Vallejo German field grey, and I'm just going to tin it down with a little bit of water and fairly carefully paint in his collar while I'm at it. So for his trousers, I'm just going to give it a base coat of German field grey, exactly the same for his tunic. Just tint it down with a little bit of water. And I'm just going to apply several thin coats just to give me a nice solid thin layer. So now we're going to start working on highlighting our uniform. As for this, we're going to use German field grey, Russian uniform, khaki, German camo beige, and German camo black brown. So for the tunic, I'm going to take some German field grey. Then I'm going to mix in a small amount of German uniform. And then I'm going to tin it down ever so slightly just with a little bit of water. So this is a near 50-50 mixture. And then I'm going to lighten it ever so slightly just with a small dab of German field beige, or should I say German camo beige. I don't want too much beige just yet, just a small amount just to add a little bit of warmth to it. We're going to go back further and add more highlight to it later. So I'm going to start sketching in this lighter colour just to frame some of the folds here. And this is a little bit tricky for me to film and paint because I'm holding the model or the figure about maybe 2.5 feet away from me. Normally you want to be keeping the figure quite close to yourself so you can have ultimate control, but I just need to keep this in shot, so I'm being a little bit more sloppy than I would be. So I'm going to add a little bit more of our German camo beige into our mix, just to lighten it up even more. And again, I'm just going to tin it down with a tiny amount of water, and then I'm going to start tracing the edges of his collar. And this is just going to help frame this detail and make it pop so it doesn't get lost. Now this looks a little bit more starker, but as the paint dries it tends to darken up a little bit. And now we're going to start adding some highlights on his trousers. So for this we're going to go back to our German field grey. We're going to add a small tab of German camo beige. About 60% of our German field grey to 40% beige would be a good ratio here. Tin it down with a little bit of water. Now it's a little bit too light for me, so I'm just going to add a little bit more field grey just to darken it down ever so slightly. So you can give and take light or dark colours until you're happy. So now I'm going to start applying our first highlight onto his trousers. And just like in the smock, I'm just going to start picking the top of creases, any areas where the fabric is pulled tight around the body so there'll be no area for any shadow to form. And I'm just going to start slowly applying this. Now this does take a little bit of time to work up highlights on a monotone colour to make it look realistic and convincing. I'm also, you can kind of see I'm tapping the brush ever so slightly at times because I'm trying to impart a little bit of a texture in the paint as well, just to give a very slight suggestion that this is made out of wool. Now this colour is going to kind of go over most of his trousers, and we're going to leave the darker colour just in the deepest recesses and in the depths of his folds. So it does take a little while just to find the details you want. So I'm just going to sketch out what I want. So I'm going to start picking folds and then start sketching. And then I'm going to start coming back with very thin layers and filling it out to create my highlights. So again, I'm keeping building and building these highlights. And I'm still using the same colour, it's just because it's nice and thin, it just gradually builds up. Now I'm going to push the highlight even further, and for this we're going to use Sunny's skin tone. Now this is a fantastic colour for trying to create nice warm highlights. So I'm just going to take a small amount, I don't need too much, and I'm going to mix it into our last mixture for our trousers. Again, thinning it down with a little bit of water. And you can see that even with a tiny amount of Sunny skin tone, how much it brightens up that colour. So we're going to be very careful with this colour though, it's very easy to overdo it. So again, we're going to start on the most pronounced details, so the tops of creases and folds, and then we're going to blend and feather back from there. You can also notice I have very little paint on my brush, just a small amount at a time. So it keeps everything nice and controllable. No, I'm not flooding the model with a load of paint. So now we're going to move on to his gaiters, and for this we're going to take some Russian uniform, khaki and German camo beige. So just like in his trousers, we're going to make up a mixture of Russian uniform, a small amount of khaki, maybe a bit more khaki, and then a small amount of German camo beige. I'm not being too precious about it at the moment, I'm just applying it quite heavy in this case. Now I have thinned this down with a little bit of water, so I do have good control over it. So I'm just going to apply it down, just get a nice solid colour here, or a base colour, and we're going to take it from there. Now, I'm not really concerned if I get it on his boots, because we're going to paint those separately, or should I say later on, but I don't want to get it on his trousers, because I just don't want to go back and start cleaning things up. So I'm just going to be a little bit careful to keep the paint where I want it. So now I'm going to start creating some highlights for his gaiters. So we're going back to our mixture, and I'm going to add more khaki to the mix, and a good dab German camo beige. So you can see I'm creating a very light colour here. If it's too light for you, just add a bit more of your Russian uniform and khaki just to pull back the highlight values ever so slightly. You can give and take really to what your tastes want. Again, having photos of original pieces, there's plenty of them online. You can kind of see what colour you want to create or how intense you want to make it. So now I switch down to a zero brush here, and I'm going to start very carefully edging in this first highlight colour. So there's actually quite a bit of detail crammed into these gaiters. So there's a lot of different folds and creases as well as stitch lines. So I'm trying to keep as much of that shadow and those folds intact. So I'm being very careful with this brush, and I'm just slowly catching out and picking out the tops of creases, the actual retaining straps of the gaiters themselves. We're going to get this colour, but I want to keep a lot of that shadow intact as well. So I'm just being kind of careful and measured here. So I'm going to push the highlight further by just taking a little bit of sunny skin tone and mixing it into our preceding highlight mixture. Again, not too much, just a small amount. And I'm just going to take a very, very small amount of this colour. I'm just going to start sketching out the highlights for this, just really focusing on the tops of creases here, and then you'll try to pronounce detail. So I'm going to start working on the leather, and for this we're going to take some German camo black brown and some flat black. So I'm going to mix these up roughly about 60-40 German camo black brown to black. Just a small amount of flat black into the mixture, and this is going to create a very rich and somewhat reflective colour for our black leather. I'm also going to thin it down again just with a small amount of water, just really a tip of a brush into a bit of water, and that's enough to thin it down. So we're going to start working on his boots first, but we're going to use this colour on all of the leather for both his entrenching tool, his belt, his Y straps, and any other leather details. So I'm also going to cut in his belt and Y straps. I'll also switch down to a zero brush here just so I have as much control over what I'm doing, as it's important to try to stay in the lines now since we have everything painted up, so I don't want to create any messes. So I'm going to start adding our first highlights, and for this we're going to go back to our original mixture, and I'm going to add the most tiny amount of sunny skin tone to the mixture, literally just the tip of a brush. Now this should be really 80% of our German camo black, brown and black mixture, and then just 10-15% sunny skin tone, just a tiny amount. And I'm going to focus this really over most of the boot, and this is just going to give us our first indication of worn leather. So now we're going to push the highlight even further, so we're going back to our sunny skin tone, and we're going to mix it into our highlight mixture, and you can see even with a small amount of sunny skin tone how much it lightens everything up. So we have to use it sparingly and gradually build up to this intensity. That's why I didn't go straight into it, because it just would look cartoonish. So this is going to be the most worn leather effects, and for this I'm really going to focus on the toes and heels of these boots, and maybe a few areas that have gotten abraded from rocks or debris or whatever. So I'm just going to focus really on the tops of his toes, his heels, and then maybe some of the more pronounced details on the boot. And of course the belt and Y straps are going to get the exact same treatment. So what I'll find here is that I more just highlight like the centre of the belts and Y straps, leaving the darker colours on either edge of it, or I'll kind of highlight the top of the belt like I'm doing here, and it just creates a nice sheen and a little bit of wornness. I'm also going to take some of our pale brown that we use for the smock base, and we're going to paint in the reinforcing tabs on the top of the Y straps. I think it's like on processed leather or it's fleece, it's one or the other. So I'm just going to paint it in with this. You can use like a red leather for this too if you wish. And I'm also going to use it too for the handle of a stick grenade as well. So going back to our highlight colour for our leather, and again we're just kind of catching out and tracing these details. So around the ammo pouches I'm just literally going to frame all of the edges of the ammo pouches, just to help frame and make that detail pop with our leather highlight colour here. Then I move on to the metal, and for this we're going to use Vallejo Model Air Steel and Metallic Black. Now, I can do this non-metallically, but however I do like using metallics for my metal effects. I just find it just adds a little bit of a flash of colour and makes the figure visually pop a little bit better. So we're going to take some of our metallic black and just a small amount, a tiny amount of steel. And you'll see even with a small amount of steel that it really does lighten things up and makes it quite vibrant. Be very careful, and I'm painting his entrenching tool. Now we have to be super careful when working with metallics. So any paint that's metallic actually has metal fibres or metal filings within it. And if you get this on any part of the model, you're going to stain it, and it's always going to have a metal sheen to it, even if you wipe it away. So we have to be really careful not to get any of this colour anywhere other than where we want to paint it. I'm also going to give the mess tin the same colour. I know these are normally painted, though I have seen some photographic evidence that sometimes these are bare metal. Now I don't know if they're bare metal that all of the paint is chipped off them, or that they're just being issued to the soldiers without any paint finish. Now I know it's a bit of like counterintuitive because you're wearing camouflage and you don't want to wear anything that's metal and reflective, but it does add a bit of visual interest at the very least. So now we're going to start adding some more glazes just to help some of the detail pop. So with everything allowed to dry, we're going to start adding some glazes just to help pop out some of these highlights and also frame some of these shadows. So I'm going to take some flat brown, mix it about 50-50 with some glazed medium. And I'm also just going to add a drop of flow improver into it too, just to thin it down even further and to just help it flow a bit better. So this is a furry light glaze, and I'm going to apply this glaze to any of the wooden effects, so the light coloured entrenching tool. I'm going to add this to kind of create a bit of a wood grain effect. I'm also going to apply it to his bread bag. So the bread bag was basically painted up in the exact same colours as his gaiters. I just forgot to film it, so exactly the same steps. However, it just didn't look like the kind of fleece material that the bread bag was made out of. So I'm just going to add this brown wash just to kind of make it look a little bit more of a kind of rougher texture. I'm also going to take the brown wash and apply it to the handle of the stick grenade. So now I'm going to add a wash of flat black, or a glaze of flat black. Now it takes me a second to cop it here, but I'm actually mixing the wrong colour, so I was mixing in Army Painter Strong Tone and then I realised that it wasn't the flat black because they look kind of similar on the wet palette. I'm just going to add a few more drops of flow improver and a bit more glaze medium because the pigment in flat black is quite strong. And again, I want this to be a very light glaze. I don't want it too strong. And this glaze is going to be applied to all of the metal areas. I'm also going to add a bit of brown glaze just to these reinforcing tabs, just to make them look a little bit more leathery. And then for the gaiters, I'm actually going to apply a very thin down glaze of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is it's more like a raw umber. So just to give him a sense of grime on his gaiters. I'm also going to paint the egg grenade in some Vallejo dark sand. Now it's quite stark at the moment, so we're going to put some glazes over that to knock it back a little bit. So it does take a few coats to build this up into a nice solid colour. So I'm just going to take some of our sepia glaze that we use on the smock and I'm going to apply it to the egg grenade. And it's just going to add a bit of weathering and also just frame some of the detail and knock back the intensity of that colour a little bit. You'll also notice that I painted his rifle, so the Car 98 has been painted with just flat brown. And then I just put a small glaze of red leather over to create some wood grain. So some final details here, I'm just taking some Vallejo model game or game colour, should I say, ghost grey, and I'm just painting in the serial numbers on his stick grenade here. I'm just doing some very faint lines of ghost grey, and it just gives the indication of the markings and serial numbers found on German stick grenades. Also, since I have the light grey colour out, I'm going to paint in the runes on his collar for his markings. These were a little bit tricky to paint. And with that, our figure is more or less finished. So now we're just going to add a sealing layer, and for this we're going to use Vallejo Premium Matte Varnish, and I'm going to thin it down with some of their airbrush thinner. So I'm just going to apply several coats of this, and this is going to, one, knock back all of the kind of satin and glossy effect that a lot of the glazes will leave on the figure, so it'll give us a lovely matte and realistic finish, and it's also going to protect our figure for later use on a vignette base. So with that guys, our figure is done. I really hope you enjoyed this. I know this figure has been, or this camouflage tutorial has been requested for a long time, and guys, I really hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. So do join me in a follow-up video where we're going to take a look at painting German Italian camouflage patterns. So do keep an eye out for that, it should be coming in the next couple of weeks. So I want to say a big thank you to everyone. I hope you're all keeping safe and that you're all doing okay in your parts of the world, even though things are getting a bit crazy out there. So thank you so much guys. I want to say a big thank you to all my patrons for their support and their patience, as I've been kind of missing of late because just been very busy at work with the pandemic. So guys, stay safe out there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. I've been Shane. Bye bye.